All right, can everyone see this?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we'll get. I missed Jihan's name here. Sorry, it's a little last minute presentation, some of the finishing touches, but over the last 2-3 weeks, Jihan has helped me as well, and we'll be presenting his slides. So please note this was jointly done. I will not be taking the credit for all of it. So while we will get into the bond in depth as the point of these bond biographies, the Louisiana Purchase has a really interesting story behind it that are important to understand the significance of this and the brilliance that actually went behind all of this. So we might offer some more historical context in other groups, but I promise it's germane and I'm not wasting your time with a bunch of baloney. So let's get right into it. Early in the 19th century, starting in the very late 18th century, Napoleon was amidst a military conquest through Europe. As one can imagine, military conquests require a lot of money, and tariff revenue suffered during these wars, which made getting a lot of money really difficult. Um, since that was the main source of revenue for governments at the time. Most governments didn't have a robust income tax system, let alone an income tax system. So Napoleon decided that at this point, getting rid of the Louisiana territories would be the best means of quick funding, especially because it was difficult to control, and they actually really didn't even have full control over the Louisiana territories due to the natives living there. But the difficulty is who had tens of millions of francs just sitting around waiting to be at Napoleon's doorstep? And the real interesting answer is no one did, really. No government did, and the US didn't. And what makes this fun is the US actually never pays France throughout this entire presentation, throughout the entire Louisiana Purchase time. So that's what'll make a lot of this fun. So finally, on April 30th, um, the U.S. eventually do get into a deal with France, but uh, and they agreed to three different things in this. There was a first document that said France is going to cede all of the Louisiana territory to the U.S. There was no financial details actually in this, but they did basically all that was said is here's all of the territory. It's now in your control. For the second document, the US themselves promises three things. First, the US commits 60 million francs to France. I'm specific with my words. They commit $60 million to France. They're not paying France. We'll get into that in a minute. Just bear with me. Um, the US commits to maintaining a 5 1/3 franc to dollar exchange rate. They'll do whatever they need to maintain that, though it's not too difficult since there was some bimetallism going on in both countries, making convertibility pretty consistent. And finally, the US commit to issuing $11.25 million worth of bonds at a 6% annual interest rate, payable in Paris, London, and Amsterdam. That's bolded for a reason. We're going to get back to it. Bear with me again. But that serves to be a very crucial part of all of this. And finally, the US would assume 3.75 million in debt that France owed to US merchants. The reason for this was from 1798 to 1800, there was a quasi war between France and the US where French privateers destroyed a lot of US merchants' ship, a lot of their property, etc. Napoleon basically said, sorry guys, I will make sure to pay back the merchants. So what the US government says is, okay, instead of owing our citizens $3.75 million, we will take on that $3.75 million and we'll pay our own citizens. If you do a quick Google search, that would yield saying that the Louisiana Purchase was $15 million, not 11.25. The $15 million is just 3.75 plus 11.25. That's counted as part of the deal. But wait a minute. Just a minute ago, I said that the U.S. didn't have a deal with France. Well, didn't buy Louisiana from France. And enter a fourth agreement between France and two banks that'll play a huge part here, known as Francis and Baring and Company, and they were based in London, and Hope and Company based in Amsterdam. What did these two banks do? These two banks agreed to one, pay France $11.25 million, not the United States. And two, France says, okay, and these $11.25 million worth of bonds will be in your control, the bank's control. So France is getting paid by Baring and Company and Hope and Company is the baseline of the story. The two banks make a deal with France that actually, instead of paying you guys 11.25 million, we're going to pay you guys 9.75 million dollars and take a 13.33% commission. So right off the bat, these two banks are basically going to make 8 million francs, and that's like a certain amount of dollars. I don't have the number for that. 8 divided by 5 1/3. Sorry, I think it's like 1.25. So that's paid over the course of 2 years. The first month, these two banks will pay France 6 million francs, and for the next 23 months, these two banks will pay $2 million a month. That was a lot. So let's break this down a little bit easier terms. What really happened here? This wasn't really a purchase, as I think I've made clear by now, from the US to France. Every other large purchase of territory in US history was done by the US paying a nation dollars and receiving back territory. This was the only purchase that wasn't like this, which makes it really cool. Really what happened is these two banks, Hope and Company, Baring Company, bought the Louisiana Tories from France and resold them to the United States. What the United States did is they basically took a long-term loan from these two banks, where they had to pay back the loan in 15 years and pay semi-annual interest during that 15 years meanwhile. Now that we're starting to talk a little bit about the bond, it's reasonable to get into the features of the bond. What really was this bond? That's why we're here. Okay, so first, Congress gave authorization for these bonds to be issued to begin with on November 10th, 1803. Later on, bonds were actually issued and sent to the banks March 31st, 1804, with a 15-year term. I'll just say this now, that all of these dates are not perfect dates, not because we don't have the actual dates, but because there's a really deep story behind each of these. In fact, at every point of this story, there's a really interesting story behind it, in terms of the negotiations, the dates, all of it. Not going to get into that for the sake of time. If I had the full hour to myself and there's no other groups, I would, but I won't. So that'll all be in the Jupiter Notebook. It's more in-depth stories of all of this. Anyways, as stated before, the U.S. paid semi-annual interest to the two banks at a 6% per coupon, 6% coupon rate for 15 years. After 15 years, the U.S. does not pay $11.25 million then to the banks, or sorry, $15 million to the banks. Instead, they split that $15 million in francs, sorry, $15 million US dollars over 4 years. I'm confusing myself, sorry. $11.25 million US dollars split over 4 years, which is $2.8125 million a year, 15 million francs. The conversions got me messed up. So really, they made the principal payments for 4 years after paying interest for 15 years, which is why after 19 years, the bonds were completely and fully redeemed with nothing left. And that was when the bonds were fully paid for. Now we can get into some data. I know these are a little bit difficult to see, but price of the bonds left, quantities on the bonds to the right, and now zoomed in picture. Here is the total amount of bonds that were outstanding. This honestly isn't too interesting of a number for the US side of things, because the US gave up the bonds right away, and the US also didn't resell these bonds. The US sold the bonds to the two banks, and from when this graph starts, this is the ownership of the banks. The banks is ownership of the bonds, and that's why this is the quantity changes as the banks pay down the bonds, not as the US pays down the bonds, because the US is paying consistently to the banks, and the banks then are going and marketing these bonds to the private sector and paying them down as they wish. So really, the banks first started to pay down bonds in 1812. That was the earliest they were allowed to. As I said before in the features of the bond, the earliest the banks were able to pay these bonds were 1812. These banks had a lot of cash at the time, and they were able to make these payments easily, and they began paying early on in 1812, and they were finished paying off the bonds in 1821. But the U.S. was only off the hook in 1823 when they finished paying the two banks for since they paid for 4 years after 1819. And now this will be a slide that Jihan takes. He was going to talk about some of the marketability of the bonds and the secondary market pricing.
Yeah, I mean, based off my summary speculation and some help from Siddharth, I can talk about specifically the events that correlated with the numbers that you guys see. So here's a quick summary. Uh, at first, you'll notice hovering at around 100, 105. This period we characterize as economic stability before the War of 1812. That was the war that, between the US and the UK, which likely actually contributed to investor uncertainty, and that to a decrease in bond prices. Then you'll notice from 1814 to 1815, a significant drop in bond prices would occur. So that would reach a low of about 75. And this sharp decline could be attributed to the aftermath of the war itself, particularly when the Washington, D.C. Building was burnt and other war-related financial strains. Then post 1815, right here on the graph, well, you can't see my screen, but yeah, I'm pointing towards there. They signed the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war, and it restored investor confidence, which we could speculate led to a swift price recovery. And then from 1870 to 1820, the price stabilized, and this was a period of stability that reflects return to normalcy and economic growth in post-war United States. And yeah, that's pretty much the quick summary of this graph.
And so, what happened with the marketability of the bonds? In short, the banks begun reselling these bonds right away in 1804. Right when they received bonds from the United States, these two banks were reselling these bonds. And right away, they were able to sell most of them, keeping only $4 million worth on their balance sheet within a year. So the vast majority of these bonds were gone already, meaning people believed in these bonds. As I mentioned before, these bonds were payable in London, France, and Amsterdam, London, Paris, and Amsterdam. And not only were they payable in these three places, but they were payable in the local currencies. These bonds were payable in pounds, francs, and Dutch guilders, which made them a lot more. There was a lot more reason to buy them because not every Dutch investor may want dollars, but there's a good chance that they're willing to take guilders much more frequently. So these made the bonds a lot easier to sell. The fact that the banks went out of their way to make sure that they had liquidity in each of these currencies and were able to exchange to exchange them. And yeah, the third bullet point basically says the same thing. And Jihan had some stuff to add about their marketing strategies.
Yeah, so as Sid already discussed, the role of Baring & Co. and Hope & Co. Specifically, their marketing strategies for Hope & Co. was that they used their networks in Amsterdam and other European money centers to sell these bonds, and that advanced the type of presentation and the actual explanation to investors of how these bonds were secured and the benefits that they could reap from them. The competitive prices from which they were able to sell the bonds ensured a good return on investment, and that could also been what attributed to the strategic approach that they took towards marketing of the firm and the ability to tap into a more diversified pool of investors. Um, yeah, so specifically for the profit margin section, we noticed that Baring & Co. and Hope & Co. made profits on these bonds and that the selling price was more than the amount that they actually initially bought it from, obviously leading to a profit margin, which was made because of how efficiently they marketed the bonds, and also from the fact that you typically in this time period, otherwise poor financial reputation in the United States was now on the mend. So that could have also attributed to the profit margins that we see.
And finally, what are the implications of this? A lot. This changed a lot. The Louisiana Purchase's success sent ripples across the world. People all over were seeing this. Why? How? What made this different? One big thing was that investors in London, Paris, and Amsterdam all were receiving checks signed by the United States all throughout the course of years, they were receiving them on time and in full. That itself was a huge step for such a large financing. So that first of all led to a lot of confidence in U.S. debt. The fact that people everywhere are receiving these. There's also some other small things like that I have here. Like this was the first time foreign government bonds were listed in a stock exchange. Third bullet point. I'll get to the rest of this later. But another big thing was that it was the sheer size of this debt, and the U.S. being able to pay it off also set a real strong message globally. The analogy I like to use is that the United States basically took out all their income in debt and managed to pay it back in the matter of 19 years. I say this because US government revenue was just about 15 million US dollars a year. The fact that they were able to take out in debt their entire income, their entire yearly income, and be able to pay it back on time in full sent a really strong message globally. And this was made clear. This is arguably the most popular sovereign bonds at the time in foreign markets. And this was a large part of what set the stage for the Rothschild brothers to later have huge success selling sovereign bonds. And that changed financial markets forever. And we see the effects of that today. So the Louisiana Purchase had a huge impact on the way on the US's own bond market today and global how bond markets function and the role bonds play. And this is the first time that bonds were used as payment as well at such a large scale, since the US paid the two banks upfront in bonds as opposed to money. And I think I've spent a decent amount of time, so I'm not going to get into these unless maybe at the end, if we have time at the end of this meeting, I can get into some more fun stories. But I think it's better to open this up to questions, since I know I went through a lot. I stumbled myself a lot, which made it maybe more confusing. So please clarify anything if you need. We're open to questions. Yes, Professor Hall.
So a couple of questions. So this was great. This was really fascinating. I learned a lot here. I thought I knew a lot about the Louisiana Purchase bonds, but clearly I didn't. So one question was, so who ultimately paid the merchants? Was
The
it
US,
did they get paid?
Yes, the U.S. government paid them in full. That's the responsibility the U.S. government took on. They did actually pay them, and
So we have the records of that they wrote.
I
They
do.
paid.
Yeah, I do have them, not in front of me, but this
Okay.
was the most debated part of the three treaties.
Yeah.
These three treaties. I don't know if I said this before, but this was the most contentious part in domestic politics. Was the U.S. was mad that they basically it looked like the optics were they let France off the hook. They did pay them back, not necessarily in full, but there was, at least in Albert Gallatin, the treasurer's own writings, that there was a serious effort made to pay them back, and there is data on much of the repayment.
Okay. Is that in like the annual reports of the Secretary of the Treasury? Is that
Yes, there were. I think
okay?
there might have been a letter from Gallatin. I went through a lot of
Okay.
research on this. I have
Yeah.
everything documented and written.
Okay. Yeah. No.
But
Yeah.
it's there.
Fascinating. And then who? So it was Barings and Hope and Company that marketed these bonds.
Yes, they were able to resell them.
Yeah. So do we have any sense of like what share of the bonds were held abroad, and how much of the bonds were held by U.S. citizens? Do we have any sense there?
I believe only. Oh, I have it right. I think only like 4 million was left in the 4 million US dollars worth was left in the US.
Okay. So most of it was
Because yeah, right away, 1/3 of the bonds were sent to London, 2/3 were sent to Paris, and then there were some amount of bonds that went back to the United States for some of the London bonds, because I think Britain had a wartime income tax that made collecting interest a little difficult. So some bondholders basically asked the House of Baring to collect interest on their behalf in the United States until 1816. So
interesting. Okay. Okay.
so those come under U.S. bonds, but they were foreigners that just wanted for tax treatment the bonds to be in the United States, and then they took
Interesting.
all the
Okay,
income
okay,
together
yeah,
once the income tax was repealed.
okay. This is great. This is great. You said all this will be in the Jupyter notebook?
Yeah, yeah. I'm still working on cleaning that up.
Great.
But
Okay.
anything, which is a lot, anything I said is not here. It is in the notebook. There
Okay,
is
and make sure you've got citations and things where
yeah,
like if you can links. This is great. Thank you very much for this.
pleasure
Thanks,
is
Sid and Jihan and one more. And Siddharth. Thank you.
Yeah, remarkable.
Thanks. I'll stop.
Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, it looks like no. All right, then Alex and I will we'll go next, chronological
Okay.
order.
That's good because my connection is starting to leave me
All right, we'll get
before
through.
it happens.
All right.
All
All
right,
right. All right.
let me get everything in place. Okay. Okay, so David and I would like to take the time to present our findings on the bonds issued during the War of 1812. And David will start off with an overview of the questions we sought to answer for this project.
So there are three central questions we want to try and answer. So what was the state of America's finances like before the War of 1812? What were the features and stories of the bonds issued during the war? And also, how did the war permanently change the nation's finances? So by asking these three questions, we want to see how the war changed sort of many leaders' views on debt financing, central banking, and paper money. So to get started, we decided to create a roadmap to try to hit all these questions. So first, we'll look at the historical context. We want to find out where the government's revenue came from at this time. And we also want to see how Thomas Jefferson and the Republicans' efforts to dismantle the Hamiltonian system of finance would affect America's ability to finance the War of 1812. And we'll explain the long-term bonds by first giving an overview, and we also chose to look closer at the loan of 1813 because of the unique way it was financed. And next, we'll look at the Treasury notes, give an overview, and look specifically at the small Treasury notes, which we thought were the most interesting and consequential. And finally, we want to look at how successful financing the war actually was, and whether the war proved Hamilton's system worked, and connect the war to the origins of the second bank.
Okay. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. With pre-war finances, Thomas Jefferson was president from 1801 to 1809, and during his time in office, his main goal was for the nation's finances was undoing Hamilton's financial system. And his first business alongside his Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, was to reduce the national debt. And to that end, his administration, along with the succeeding Madison administration, retired more than 60% of the debt from the Federalists. At the same time, Jefferson chose to sign the Embargo Act of 1807, which ended up hurting American trade, since duty revenues decreased from 13.3 million in 1811 to 9 million in 1812. And since the trade was the major source of revenue, this meant that America would be entering the war with insufficient funds.
There was also the issue of the first bank of the U.S. So after Jefferson left office, the Democratic Republicans in Congress, against the wishes of Gallatin, refused to recharter the bank. And this meant that a year before the war began, there was no national bank that could make loans to the government during the war. And on top of that, the nation's securities markets at the time were pretty small and regional. And so because Jefferson was really scared that like a network of securities dealers would sort of become corrupt. And so he really sought to limit their influence during his time in office. However, this would prove to be a problem during the war when the Treasury needed to market these massive loans. So I guess in summary, all there is to say is like America is unprepared for the upcoming war.
Both long-term bonds and short-term bonds were issued during the war. And as for the long-term bonds, these typically could be fully payable after 12 years. 6% was the common interest rate among almost all of them, and many of these bonds were sold at a discount. But we'll take a closer look at the loan of 1813 as an interesting example. So we'll start with an overview. Congress basically authorizes a 16 million loan in early 1813. And in terms of marketing, Congress does add a commission for agents, but in the end, they simply announced the subscription day and waited for people to come. Without any private underwriters, that was how they typically marketed bonds at the time. The poor terms of the loan, including the 6% interest rate, meant that 10 million went unsold, $10 million. And so Secretary Gallatin asked three wealthy men, Stephen Girard, John Jacob Astor, and David Parrish, to help finance the remaining $10.1 million. With the help of smaller firms, the plan succeeded, and the syndicate assumed the remaining 10 million at a discount of $88 with a 6% interest rate.
Okay, so next we want to sort of look more closely at the market price data for the loan of 1813. And so by doing so, we could sort of connect any price fluctuations to our findings on the period. And so, yeah, so here we have the graph of the market price. So first there was like a steep drop off in the price during 1814. And so during this period, like prices traded between $75 and $85, and this meant a yield between 6 and 8%. And so Edwin J. Perkins said like this was quote unquote, the nation's worst outlook for credit since the Revolutionary War. And so there are two major reasons for this decline. So first, trade declined massively, so down to only 6.9 million in 1814. And the second was a sort of bleak military outlook at the time. So I annotated the burning of Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1814 during the British's Chesapeake campaign. And so this is sort of America's like low point during the war. But beginning in 1815, the price rebounds. So the yield on these bonds falls from 9% to 7%, and the price jumps to $100. And these events correlate with like the end of the war and Andrew Jackson's victory in New Orleans. And so with the war coming to an end, like foreign trade resumes pretty quickly. And so customs duties increased to $45.9 million in 1815 and $81 million in 1816. And finally, another notable price increase occurs during the Panic of 1819. The prices increased from $99 to $110 in 1821. And so although I'm not completely sure, but after talking to George, I assume that the best explanation would be a sort of a flight to safety. Like these bonds were the safest investment at the time. So here's some key takeaways. So the Treasury has just sort of successfully cooperated with private underwriters. And so therefore, like Republicans' fears about securities dealers are sort of quelled. Like Thomas Jefferson had been really afraid of corruption arising from like deals like this, where a network of security dealers and really tried to limit their influence, right? But the success of the loan of 1813 proved that these dealers were kind of necessary during times of crises. And finally, the one thing I'll point out is like this would be the first and the last time during the war that the Treasury would gather like outside financiers to market these bonds. And so like future negotiations between like the Treasury and the syndicate would break down. And at that point, the Treasury would really kind of struggle to market these loans and was sort of forced to rely on short-term notes for funding. And so this brings us on to the Treasury notes.
Okay, so the other type of bond issued during the war were short-term bonds in the form of treasury notes. And these were issued due to the fact that long-term bonds weren't generally selling well. And there were 5 separate issues of treasury notes spread out through the war, and there were common features that these notes shared. For instance, they were redeemable after 1 year. They typically had an interest rate of 5.4%. They usually sold at par. They typically came in denominations of $20, $100, and $1,000, but later smaller denominations came out in 1815. And finally, they could be used to pay duties, taxes, and they could be used to purchase land. And although there were many issues of treasury notes, we found the 1815 issue of small treasury notes the most interesting and consequential. So the small treasury notes were the last issue, and they were issued in 1815, right after the war ended, to pay off arrearages. And the major difference between the issue and the previous issues was that there were smaller denominations, less than $20. So for the most part, the features stayed the same with slight variations in the interest rate. But one major difference was that these small notes were now exchangeable for 6% or 7% stock.
So we wanted to sort of look at the consequences and analyze the performance of these notes. So I guess the question we're asking was like, so what happened after these notes were issued? So the first thing that many people were concerned about was inflation from like a sudden injection of notes like into circulation. But now inflation did increase during the war. And one statistic I got here was like, and the treasury notes did play a part in that. One statistic I have here was that the average price inflation hit like 35%. But specifically for these small treasury notes, many feared like a similar scenario back to like the continental currency, like decades ago. However, according to Perkins, at least, when the small treasury notes entered circulation, there wasn't like an inflationary effect. For two main reasons. So first was like the small treasury notes made up less than 4% of the treasury's total debt, and these small treasury notes were convertible into 7% stock. So in summary, like these treasury notes generally sold well. Like banks could use the larger denominations for their reserves, and merchants use them to pay duties at customs houses. And the second thing was that these small treasury notes and like the rest of the treasury notes were all redeemed promptly on their maturity dates. So Edwin Perkins noted that by the end of the war, all of the treasury notes had been retired or converted, and all the notes were redeemed at face value. So some final thoughts, like I said, in summary, the treasury notes were rather successful, and the small treasury notes are like the first time we see circulating currency since the Revolutionary War. And I read some like newspaper articles at the time that mentioned how these notes were in fact circulating and were actually quite popular at the time. And they didn't depreciate like the continental currency in the past. And quoting Perkins for one final time, like he called them quote unquote distant relatives of the continental currency, which shows you that it's sort of a new experience for America.
Okay. So taking a step back, was the funding of the war an overall success? And from what Perkins and Kagan are saying, it was. And here are the two main reasons. First of all, the federal debt was low per capita at $18. Therefore, they were in a relatively healthy financial position. And the second reason was that the US had never missed an interest payment since 1790. Therefore, there was a high investor confidence that repayment would be on time.
So the question, I guess, was like, why was there so much like difficulty at the beginning? So like the whole issue of like failing to market these loans like may have been really unnecessary, because if the Madison administration like chose to raise the interest rates from 6%, so like Madison was like trying to like save American taxpayers like from the burden of having to pay like interest on these loans like in the future. But instead, like because 6% wasn't the proper interest rate, they really like struggled to market these loans, and they were eventually forced to rely on treasury notes. So I think one of the most interesting effects of the war is like a shift within like the Democratic Republican Party. So like they come to like the realization that America needs financial institutions during wartime. Like without a national bank, it was like really difficult to sort of like float these bonds. And like I mentioned, they had to resort to treasury notes. And so like after the war, the Hamiltonian system sort of like returns like after being dismantled. So like many Republicans like Henry Clay, like James Madison, like these people who had been opposed to the first Bank of the United States are like the ones that are like supporting a new national bank after the war. And they like realize its importance in like providing short-term loans during crises. And I thought it was really interesting because like Madison was actually the one that opposed the first bank in 1790, but now in like 1815, he's actually challenging arguments that the bank was unconstitutional, which I think really shows some like character development in that case. And so that leads me on to my to my point about the second bank. So like Madison and the Republicans not only end up reviving the second bank immediately after the war, but giving it 3.5 times the starting capital than the first bank. And so, I mean, this doesn't mean like Madison became like a full-blown Hamiltonian or anything, but he sort of like really realizes the pragmatic value of having a national bank. And so in summary, like although the Federalist Party is like really no longer a major political force at this time, at least it's like kind of dying, if not dead already. Its ideas are sort of like being absorbed or taken up by the Republicans, and due to their experiences during the War of 1812. So that's it. Thank you for listening. I'll open the floor to any questions.
David, this is Tom.
Yes.
So this was both of you. This was beautiful. And are the references are you gonna have references, to Perkins and so on, like when you read this newspaper?
Yes, we do. We'll put them all
Okay.
in the bond buyer's notebook.
Great, and the slides. Okay, this is magnificent. Okay, I'll just shut up.
Sid.
Let me just make sure I heard this right. To me,
Yeah.
this was pretty incredible. But these treasury notes paid 5.5% interest, and they were able to be used transactionally in taxes, duties, and land.
Yeah, quote unquote, yeah. Yes.
So like people were able to just hold these as like, basically a cash instrument that's paying interest.
Yes, exactly. That's why banks were really into it.
Yeah, that's something.
Okay, well,
This was terrific. I know we've got some other presentations, so I'll refrain.
got it. Definitely talk later. If you have
We
any
can
more
talk later. Yeah.
Okay, well, if no one we'll stop there. We'll move on to the next presentation. I think chronologically speaking, it's these. Well, it will be the Civil War, but probably the currency sixes are next.
David,
Yes.
I was kind of shying away from it, but I'm just gonna ask you the question real
Okay,
quick.
go ahead.
Because
Yeah.
I'm a bit confused on this. You said like the Panic of 1819 led to a flight of safety and increased
Yeah.
like bond prices. I think it said like $110 in 1821.
Yeah.
I'm just confused, like, what were like the mechanisms behind it? Like, how did that just happen? Because I'm just confused on like, was this like random or I'm not sure what the history behind it is exactly.
Oh, okay, yes. I had the exact same question. I actually asked George about this like a few days ago.
I think you asked me, David.
Oh yeah, I actually asked
You
both
asked
of you
both of
guys.
us.
Yes.
Okay, you asked both of us. Yeah, here's the quick answer. Okay, so think you're a portfolio holder. You're either a foreign or an American investor, and you're holding a portfolio, and a lot of them are like speculate. They're state banks that are going belly up. Lots of state banks stocks and state banks that that are going to renegotiate. Real estate deals that are falling apart, and then there's some federal bonds that have this record of paying good interest. And as David said, and Alex said, they've established a reputation. They're going to pay hell or, no matter what. So you go to the you twist your portfolio toward the relatively safer things, and that drove up their. That's the deal. That's the story that can explain this. It's only a story, but the story was reverse engineered to fit David and Alex's data. So that's, I think, what George and I had in mind. Whether or not you buy it.
But yeah, I don't have any direct evidence of this. So it'd be nice if we could find some newspaper articles that say, "Oh my gosh, I want to get out of state banks," or letters that say, "Get me out of state banks and get me into the federal bonds." But or at least I don't have any evidence of that. It's backward engineered, as Tom said.
Very good. Very good.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah. So just basically media spread in reaction to the panic of, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it would be. And you actually see this. You actually see this today. You see lots of things that don't make any sense. The world goes to hell, and U.S. Treasuries go up in value. But that's because a lot of other stuff is even worse. Okay, that's okay.
Okay. Thank you.
By the way, you guys are asking. These are great questions as well as great presentations. And by the way, that presentation would have been, that project would have been the prize-winning senior thesis at NYU or at Stanford. I'll just say that one. So David, if it didn't have to compete with some of the other presentations that this group is preparing.
Thank you. All right. Yeah, wait, what was I supposed to say? Oh yeah. I think next up is the currency sixes. So it's Sanjeev and Elizabeth.
Yeah, give me 1 second. You guys see my screen? Can you guys see my screen? Okay.
Yes.
So Liz and I worked on the currency sixes bond, and yeah. So the objective of the bond was to obviously explore relevant details of the currency sixes bond, and then we also created some graphs on the yields and the secondary market price of the bond, and he wanted to explore how history affected the prices and the yields of the bond. So for a quick overview of our bond biography, or a quick structure, I mean, so first we had the overview, then we have a quantitative analysis kind of how much was sold, the secondary market price, and then we have some notable events that affected the bond price and yield. And then we'll go on to some yield trends, then talk about who invested in the bond, and then the marketability of the bond, and then we'll conclude. So for a quick overview, the currency sixes were pretty important in financing the transcontinental railroads during the 19th century, which was a monumental project that kind of revolutionized transportation and commerce in the United States. And the Transcontinental Railroad project facilitated the connection between the eastern and western parts of the country, which kind of boosted economic development. So for some features of the bond, it was issued in 1862 under the Pacific Railway Act. It had a coupon rate of 6% that was paid semi-annually. It had a 30-year maturity date, and it had a principal value of $100. So for some key findings in the quantitative analysis, Congress authorized around $64 million in bonds to construct the railroads. And we also found from our data that there was a maturity date from around 1888 to 1889. So first we have this graph of the total outstanding of the currency sixes bond. As you can see here, it's around 64 million consistently. So Congress authorized around about $64 million in these bonds to fund the railroads. And the massive funding effort showed the importance of the railroads in national development. And so it was initially sold at par value, which was $100. But the secondary market prices kind of fluctuated based on economic conditions, which we'll get into later, investor sentiment, and the progress of the railroad. So the bonds prices, which obviously we'll get into later, reflects the economic turbulence of the late 19th century, which includes the Panic of 1873 and other events. So for regarding this graph, for the majority of the time shown in the graphs, the quantity of the bond remains steady around $64 million. And the stability kind of shows that there was no significant events that affected the bond quantities during this period. However, there's a sudden drop off in the late 1890s, specifically 1898 and 1899. And these drop offs likely correspond to the bonds reaching their maturity date. And considering the 30-year maturity period that was mentioned before, the sharp decline around the late 1890s makes sense since these bonds were issued in the early 1860s.
Okay, so Sanjeev has made really clear the story of the currency six bonds are really intertwined with the events of the time period. And so annotated on our graphs are going to be four main events: the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, the amendment to that act in 1864, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, and then the Panic of 1873. And these all marked very different stages in the support and funding of the railroads. And specifically, the Pacific Railway Act authorized the construction of this railroad on federal lands. And then From this act, the government also endorsed two companies, the Union and then the Central Pacific Construction Companies, to begin work. And so we'll kind of see how those two companies began trying to take advantage of the aid that Congress provided, and were kind of competing factors throughout the entire construction of this project. And then the amendment of the act provided a lot more opportunities for securing the construction of the railroads in the form of introducing land grants and issuance of government bonds. And then on May 10th, 1869, the railroad workers in Utah drove down that ceremonial golden spike that joined together both lines from east to west so that the Transcontinental Railroad could be used. And then finally, the Panic of 1873 was when the European stock market crashed and American investors began rapidly selling off their investments in domestic areas, namely the railroad projects around the country. And for example, one of the largest investment houses that was financing the Northern Pacific portion of the railroad, called J. Kirk and Company, that went bankrupt. So it was kind of a complete disaster. But the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed by then, so it kind of impacted some smaller railroads that had come about after this larger national project. So now we'll be talking a bit about pricing, and the goal of this section of our bond biography was to understand how those notable events we just talked about impacted the average pricing of the bonds over time. And the two key findings that we had that kind of provided us with some context was that obviously the average par value of these bonds was $100, and then we also found that the secondary market values were very dependent on economic conditions, which does make sense because of the instability throughout wartime, both domestically and internationally. And so that resulted in some of these bonds being sold at a discount to par value. So this graph tracks the average pricing of the currency 6 bonds from around 1856 to 1880. And so if we see near the Pacific Railway Act, the pricing is continually rising, and we felt that this was because of the authorization of that construction, which would have created a more secure investment for Americans. And then the opposite is true for the amendment to the Pacific Railway Act in 1864, which shows that drastic drop in average price. And we felt that this could be due to the fact that after the increase of federal aid, the second round of federal aid, larger construction companies, and more specifically the Union Pacific, began overcharging on construction costs to try and turn a maximized profit in a shorter period of time. And then because of this, investor confidence in redeeming their certificates probably fell, which took those average prices down with them. And so now I'll let Sanjeev talk a bit more about the yield trends that we saw.
Yeah, so similar to the price trends, the yield trends of these bonds also reflected the return on investment you're getting, and were also influenced by the broader economic environment, like similar to the prices, I guess. And so we have a list of how our notable events kind of affected the yields. And so this was our first graph, and we thought these random spikes in the graph were outliers. So then we created a second graph using the 1.5 times the IQR formula, and we removed all the outliers. So first, there was minimal change after the Pacific Railway Act, and it's gonna make sense since the bonds just got, authorized. So there was probably a stable economic environment and investor sentiment, which minimized immediate fluctuations of the yield. There was also a massive or kind of big increase after the 1864 amendment. So that as Liz mentioned earlier, the 1864 amendment allowed companies to kind of overcharge. As we saw in the price graph, it kind of the price plummeted after the 1864 amendment. And since prices and yields have an inverse relationship, this kind of makes sense, because I guess there was also more perceived risk, because the 1864 amendment provided more funding and support for the railroad, and it may have like introduced new uncertainties or highlighted the financial burden on the government, which led to higher yields as investors probably demanded more return for the perceived risk. So there was also like this increase then decrease after the completion of the railroad. So I think the increase was like due to like speculative activities maybe, or concerns about the financial impact of finishing the project. But then the decrease indicates that once the railroad was finished, the long-term there was more long-term economic benefits that were visible, and there was increased investor confidence. And also for this decrease in the Panic of 1873, we thought that might have been a mistake in the data, because you would kind of expect the yields to increase after the 1870 Panic of 1873. So yeah, this we thought was a mistake in the data.
Okay, so the investor section was actually very insightful for us and one that we would have loved to continue diving deeper into. However, from the sources we were able to find, the primary investors were common mid-sized investors, so that's the classic American man. And these were the people subject to those high-level appeals that were connected to marketing the bonds, which we'll discuss later on. And we tried to find records of these original, like everyday people and from transactions from like investment houses, but we weren't able to find anything conclusive yet. And then the most notable large investors in Theodore Judah's original idea of the Transcontinental Railroad were the Big Four. So these were the guys that struck it rich in the California Gold Rush and then became business partners. And so the Big Four were made up of Charles Crocker, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, and Mark Hopkins. And so they developed the Central Pacific branch. And so after pooling their funds, they decided to finance this, but ended up trying to take advantage of the gullible Congress at the time. And then it was also fascinating to learn about the Central Pacific's competing company, which was the Union Pacific, headed by Thomas C. Durant, which also ended up in the credit mobilier scandal. So there was a lot of manipulation going on because of this third investor, and it's been pretty clear that Congress is the one who's been providing a lot of the investment and seeing this project into completion. The president himself, Lincoln, thought of this project as a war effort and then strongly supported the legislation that was passed, providing a lot of federal aid. So this was a project that Congress really wanted to finish and complete, and they were going to do that through providing tax dollars and creating a more secure bond to try to widen that pool of investors. And so the marketability section of our bond was looking to answer the question of how and why did those investors become a part of this project. And we found three bigger findings that could have led them to. And the first was the first mortgage status of these bonds. And so the federal government decided to set these bonds at first mortgage status. So in the case of a default, the currency 6 bonds would be paid back before any of the federal ones. And so obviously this made the bonds a much more secure choice than maybe any of the other domestic and international projects of the time. And then to further incentivize the construction companies to finish each section of the railroad before moving on to the next, the government implemented their own bond pricing. And so we found this section kind of in the amendment of the original Pacific Railway Act, where the government implemented a tiered system based on difficulty of terrain. So the easy grade, so obviously the Transcontinental Railroad spanned the northern half of the United States. So the easy grade bonds were the plain sections, and that was $16,000 per mile, the moderate plateau area was between the Rocky and Sierra Nevada mountains, and that was set at $32,000 per mile. And then the mountainous regions, which were the most difficult and most dangerous areas to construct a railroad, was set at $48,000. And then there was a date that was set, January 1st, 1874. And this was kind of says a forfeiture of rights day. So if the construction companies didn't finish these sections of the railroads before that date, they wouldn't have the ability to redeem those bonds. So I guess it was kind of a way to keep them accountable and have some measure in place to try and again finish this big project. And then the last method that we found or the last larger method of marketability that we found was land grants. And so this was from the original 1862 Act. And so the government began selling off portions of the land directly adjacent to the tracks. And they sold it in this checkerboard style pattern. And the dimensions are listed there. So 200 feet on each side. And then sections were 10 square miles of each. And so the government would keep one square and the other would go off to sell it to the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. And the goal of that was to sell to potential settlers or farmers that would then help to return and expand the financing for the railroads. So then we have like this newspaper clipping, and it's kind of an advertisement for some of that land where the companies were able to share information on the climate and environment and just kind of get more investors involved. So at the end of the construction, both companies combined owned a total of 180 million acres of land. So unfortunately, some of them kept the land as like collateral instead of selling it, which lines up pretty well with their other manipulative behavior. But yeah, these three things were kind of the biggest factors in trying to get more investors involved and again to finance the overall construction.
So one of our main findings was the railroad bond yields reflected major economic changes. So fluctuations in the bond yields during the 19th century were often reflective of the broader economic health, which like impact obviously the Civil War and major infrastructure projects. And similar yield analyses continue to provide insights today into economic stability.
And then my biggest takeaway after analyzing like the fluctuations in average bond pricing is how even during a time where there wasn't too much rigid financial structures or support to fund and see into completion such a large national project, the construction companies and Congress were able to get it done. And I think that's because of the innovative measures that both Congress and the construction companies took, whether it was the first mortgage status, which created kind of a direct revenue for expanding the finances, or holding the construction companies accountable to a certain degree through the tiered payment system, were all factors that allow this project to be completed. And then we kind of discussed this with Chris yesterday, but it obviously wouldn't have been possible for the government to try and both fund and construct the railroad, and it wouldn't have been possible for the construction companies to fund the entire project. So it's kind of striking a balance between the two. And in the future, obviously, a lot of American private industries are still looking to the government to help them build businesses and fund these larger projects. But there's definitely been lessons learned in terms of how much aid to give, how much regulation there has to be in order for that partnership to remain balanced. So that's it from us, and we'd love to take any questions you guys have. Yes, Dr. Hall.
Thanks so much for this. This was great. This was great. So this first mortgage status, I thought was was really interesting. So what was the revenue? Was it revenue from the railroads that paid the bondholders back? And then it was guaranteed then by US taxpayers, or was it US tax dollars that paid the bondholders back?
I don't think yeah, from the
Okay.
paragraph that we found, it was just basically saying that they would be able to receive that money first from, I'm assuming, the taxpayer dollars before. And then those government bonds that we talked about, like the tiered systems, those were in like the second loan status. So not sure how specifically they did that. But yeah.
Oh, this is great. Great. I would have to say that graph where you just see the declining yields over time just is yeah, that one. It's really dramatic. That's a beautiful graph. Just shows you, how, yields on railroad bonds falls from 7% to 5% over the course of 40 years. It just that's really dramatic. That's a beautiful graph. Yeah. 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 And I have to think a little more about the Panic of 1873. Realizing I need to learn more about the Panic of 1873. I need to learn more about the Panic of 1819. Oh, this is great. Thank you.
Well, first, does anyone else have any questions? Okay. So I guess we'll just move straight on to the last presentation. Liam and Alon.
Alon, can you share your screen? Okay, thank you. All right. So me and Alon, we analyzed the Liberty and Victory loans, which were used by the United States to fund World War I, to fund our time in World War I. You can go to the next one. All right. So the three main takeaways that we hope you'll learn from this presentation are that the bonds were mainly bought by citizens out of patriotic drive during the war, and that bonds were continued to be sold on the secondary market even after World War I, and that the state of the U.S. economy has significant influence over bond prices, much like the other bonds that we've already seen. And actually, what's interesting about this is that the bonds themselves actually had some of the actually played a part in the state of the U.S. economy. So we'll get into that later. All right. And so this presentation, we'll first go over some historical context for the bonds, like specifically the marketability, and a little bit about how the war ended up being financed. So taking a broader looking at the big picture of the Treasury Secretary William McAdoo's thoughts while he was planning it out. Then we'll dive into the bond's individual characteristics, their features, and we'll see some cool patterns in there. Then we'll explain the cost for the significant price drops on the secondary market of each bond around 1920 through 1921, and we'll finish it after that. Okay, so first we're going to go over some historical context. So much like in the Civil War when Salman Chase asked Jay Cook to help him market the 520s, the 520 bonds. Instead of hiring a third party, McAdoo insisted that the government create an organization to specifically just to sell these Liberty bonds. And one of the big things about the campaign, some things to know, is he wanted to diversify buyers among economic classes, and to try to diversify it geologically as well. So you'll see some of these posters that were used to try to sell the bonds on the left. It's much more of a the left appeals much more to the patriotic drive, and on the right, they get a little bit more emotional as the war continues, and you'll notice in the middle, it actually tells you to the poster tells people to actually keep their bonds, which was an important point that a lot of economists made while the United States was about to enter the war, that the bonds should not be that people should shouldn't sell their bonds right after they get them, just because that might cause inflation. Um, and there's another point that I don't have a poster of, but people also were encouraged not to take loans from banks to buy bonds, instead to reduce spending to buy the bonds for the same reason. Um, in terms of trying to diversify it from a socioeconomic standpoint, the nomination started at about $50, I think. But there were what were called war saving certificates, which were essentially bonds that were sold starting at about $4. And they had a 4.5% annual interest rate, and they were redeemable after about 5 years. Just to try to make sure that anyone could show their support for the war by buying a bond and supporting the United States financially. All right. I'll talk a little bit about the how exactly the war was financed. So pre-war, there was a lot of apprehension among economists from borrowing from the public because the power of patriotism. It didn't seem like it had much power. And a lot of economists were leaning towards instead trying to finance it mainly through taxation. William McAdoo knew that this extreme view wouldn't really work because if you increase taxes during a war, people aren't going to be very pleased with the war. So he tried to he leaned a little bit more into bond finance. So the result ended up being about 25% taxes and the rest of as bond finance. One big appeal for wealthy people, especially about the bonds, were that they were exempt from income taxes. So the Wilson administration at the time, they were trying to increase the income tax for higher tax brackets, and this was actually a really popular choice for wealthy portfolios because it was exempt from income tax and the wartime surtax, which ended up getting pretty high a little bit farther into the war. And post-war, once the patriotic drive fell, the Federal Reserve they picked up the slack in bond purchases by a little bit by directly buying the bonds, but mostly by encouraging banks to buy bonds by offering good rates on loans that banks could secure using the Liberty loans. This ended up causing a lot of inflation that ended up causing a problem in the economy from 1920 to 1921, which we'll take a closer look at later.
So now we will go into some summaries about the bonds. So these are some public holdings and price graph examples. So here's a graph of the public holdings for the first Liberty loan, which was also convertible. And here's a secondary market price graph for the first Liberty loan. And generally, like most of the graphs of the public holdings and market price had the same trends for like most of the loans, except for the public holding graphs for the Victory loans because they were issued after World War I, and the public holdings were happening at different times. Also, bonds continued being traded even after World War I as it goes into the 1920s and okay, so here's some overall characteristics for the loans. So generally, the amount of subscribers, so the first two loans were convertible. However, the other ones were not. And also, the secondary Liberty loan was only convertible one time. The amount of subscribers increased for a while, but then during Liberty Loan 4, it decreased, possibly due to the war coming to an end. But then it increased again for the Victory loans. The amount offered also increased until Liberty Loan 4, but then decreased with the Victory loans, possibly due to the end of the war. This similarly, there was similar trends with the amount subscribed and accepted, although they also decrease with the Victory loans, and they seem to peak at Liberty Loan 4, possibly due to Liberty Loan 4 generally on average having an average amount per subscriber, even if there weren't that many. So the amount subscribed wasn't actually that low. So the average subscribed seems to decrease until Liberty Loan 3 and then increase again. And in general, it seems like people are trying to buy more bonds as the war went on, but like not as much afterwards. Okay, now we will go into some price change analysis. So yeah. Okay, so as seen with the secondary market prices of the Liberty and Victory loans, there was like a drop in prices from 1920 to 1921, which can be attributed to the depression of 1920 to 1921, which we mentioned earlier in the historical context slides. So during this period, unemployment rates rose to 12% and prices saw a 15% rise. Overall, the economy suffered a large recession. Consequently, the US government lost a significant amount of credibility, meaning higher yields and lower prices for the bonds were demanded. However, the US quickly recovered in 1922, meaning the government was able to regain credit. Thus, yield demand wasn't as high and prices rose back up again. So here are some potential reasons for the depression. So initially, when the US came out of World War I, the economy was expanding largely, which possibly explains why many bonds seemed to do pretty well before the drop. Unemployment had decreased to 1.4%, while productivity and inflation both increased. However, the Federal Reserve, in order to finance military operations, was trying to keep interest rates low to decrease coupon rates. So there were uncontrolled inflation increases. And then, due to reforms initiated to decrease inflation, which included a government spending cut by 75% and an increase of the discount rate, there was a recession.
All right. So I will go back over the key takeaways and conclude the presentation. All right. So let's start from the historical context. Bonds were bought out of patriotic drive, and they continued being sold on the secondary market even after World War I. And they did survive the depression in 1920 and 1921, which did have a significant influence over bond prices. Like some of them got down to about $80 or $75. So yeah, that wasn't good. All right, here's our bibliography. And definitely ask any questions if you have any. All right, David.
All right, I have a question. Wait, so
Okay.
did you say that these bonds were income tax exempt?
They were, yes.
Okay.
The interest on the bonds were exempt from income taxes.
Okay, got it. So my question would be, so who did that help the most? Like, did it help the wealthy and the middle class or slash poor equally? Or was that specifically benefiting, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that's specifically for the wealthiest Americans to get involved?
I mean, it definitely it definitely helped the middle class and lower class, but what made it particularly helpful to invest to wealthier people was that the Wilson administration was actively trying to impose a larger income tax on larger incomes. So if a wealthy person bought a lot of the Liberty loans, they wouldn't have to pay any income tax on that interest, which is, of course, great.
Got it. Thank you. That's perfect.
Thanks so much for this. This was interesting. Those posters are really dramatic. You think about that. I have to say, if anyone wanted to continue in the fall on this, I think one question I'd have would be that's just come out of actually, I mean, a number of themes have arisen when you put all these projects together, and it's really wonderful. But one is like, so we were just talking an hour ago about bond prices, right? You know, right after the War of 1812, there's a recession, and you know, right after World War I, there's a depression. After World War II, bond prices go up, and we say, "Oh, it must have been a flight to safety. That's what it must be." But then, after World War II, after World War I, bond prices fall. Why was there no flight to safety then? So I'm not expecting an answer now. I don't have an answer. I don't know, but that would be I think kind of an interesting question, and you see it in the panic of 1873. You know, right? Why didn't bond prices move then more? The yields don't really change much then. So, kind of 1873, you don't see much. You see bond prices go up in 1819, and they fall in 1920. So,
this is great.
Yeah.
Like when did the U.S. become a place where sovereign debt became something you flew to when you wanted safety, and when was it something you ran away from?
Yes, you'd have thought of
Yeah. Yep.
the centuries would be flipped, but
Yep.
100 years later.
This again was a great presentation. The table that you had about subscriptions, would you show that again?
Alon,
Can you
could you okay, she got it. Thank you.
just to make sure. So what's recorded in here? You have these numbers like, so it's number of subscribers. I got it. That's fascinating. So the source of that is going to be in the references that you have?
Yes, it is.
In the,
So that's unique individuals
it's in
who
here.
bought these.
Yes.
Yeah. There's another big difference between War of 1812 we just saw, where number of subscribers, 3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, this is fascinating. Really good work.
Yeah.
A great table. Good for you. So all four presentations were fantastic and exceeded my very high expectations.
I agree. This from our perspective, wow, it's been a remarkable team effort here, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing these notebooks. And yeah, this is fantastic. I hope it's been fun.
So
yeah.
Whether or not it's been fun, it's been very excellent.
Yeah.
So David, would you share the video with me if you can?
Oh, yeah, no problem. Yeah, I was recording the entire time, so I'll send that after.
Okay, that's great. And I suspect some other people will want to see it too. But I'm impressed by everyone who spoke today. I'll just say that.
All right.
So you're chairman, David.
Yes. Well, if anyone else has any final words, they can say them now. But I guess my only thing is like, well, yeah, we'll get the notebooks and we'll combine them all into a Jupyter book. So we've already gotten started on that, and we'll send that in a separate email. But yeah, thank you for listening and taking your time to listen to our presentations. We hope you enjoyed. And yeah, I guess that's all I really have to say. So I think this meeting has been
Great job,
Let
everyone.
me just say, so thanks so much, and if I don't see you guys, feel free to stay in touch and let, you know, happy to continue these conversation. Yeah, as you guys, you know, move on to other things. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much for all this work that you did this summer. This
Thank
was really
everybody.
impressive.
Bye.
Okay.
bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye.
much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
I'm surprised my connection.